Who taught you the most? Who in your life taught you to learn and keep on learning? Those are the questions that have been echoing through my mind this week. We forget sometimes that who we have become is not entirely of our own making. We forget that we had teachers, both good and bad, and that we had role models, both worthy and unworthy. We forget that our job is to recognize them, acknowledge them, weed out the less useful, and proceed from there, neither to be static nor complacent, but to continue to grow. Good morning. My name is Annie Foerster, and I'm minister here at First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church in Fort Worth, Texas. Welcome to our Sunday hour of togetherness. Let us begin our worship with music from our pianist, Misha Beresnev. My call to worship this morning was written by Robert French Levins. Holy and beautiful, the custom which brings us together in the presence of all that is sacred and all that is loved. To face our ideal, to remember our loved ones in absence, to give thanks, to make confession, to offer forgiveness, to be enlightened, and to be strengthened. Through this quiet hour breathes the worship of ages, the cathedral of music and history. Three unseen guests attend: faith, hope, and love. Let our hearts prepare them a place to dwell and to grow. I was taken by the words, the cathedral of music and therapy, and the music and history, and that led me to our first hymn, number 105, From Age to Age. Our song leader this morning is Della Purdon.
From age to age, how grandly rise the one song shall yet be heard. Move onward in thy course sublime, O everlasting word, O everlasting word.
Our chalice is a symbol of our gathering in fellowship. It stands for the light of understanding, the beacon of hope, the fire of commitment, and the warmth of community. It is powerful because we understand that the light within each of us is nourished by it, and from that light we give back to the world. And so we remind ourselves of these things this morning by repeating the words of Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations. He said, each morning we must hold out the chalice of our being to receive, to carry, and to give back. Lovely words. But okay, who was the first Secretary General of the United Nations? Please join me in saying our covenant that we repeat every Sunday. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve others in community to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with creation. Thus do we covenant with one another. The answer to my pop quiz is Trygve Lie. He was the first Secretary General of the United Nations. I had to look it up. As for my questions for you this morning, I think I already asked them in my welcome to you. Who taught you the most in your life? Maybe I could alter it to who taught you the most useful things you needed to know to become a functioning adult, one who kept learning, one who kept seeking, kept growing. It's my question this morning because I'm going to do a little digging into our institutional history, and I found that question useful as I looked back at who we have been as a religious institution, who we are today, and who we might become if we are thoughtful and caring, if we receive, carry, and give back. Our story for all ages this morning is told by Della Purden, our song leader as well. I figured she was a mother and probably is a great storyteller, so I asked her to do it.
So today I'm going to tell a story about a girl who was searching for a porpoise. Now, as you probably know, a porpoise is a sea mammal in the dolphin family. Porpoises are smaller and shyer than dolphins, and they are much more difficult to find. But porpoises are very important.
Della, the topic for today is about finding purpose. Purpose, not porpoise.
Purpose.
Yeah.
So not porpoises?
No.
Well, oops. Do you mind if I tell my porpoise story anyway? It's the only story I have ready for this morning.
Well, sure. Let's give it a try.
So there once was a girl named Amira, and all she wanted for her birthday was a porpoise of her very own. She wished and hoped and dreamed of a porpoise. She asked her parents and her grandparents. She told all her friends at school that she was getting a porpoise for her birthday. But her birthday came and went, and she did not get a porpoise. She was disappointed, and she wanted answers. So she asked her parents, and they said, "Oh, Amira, we couldn't get you a porpoise. That is something you need to seek out for yourself. Amira looked at her parents kind of funny and said, "You know I said a porpoise, right? Like the sea mammal that's smaller than a dolphin?" And her parents looked at each other and said, "You can't have a wild animal for your birthday either." She asked her grandparents, and they said, "Oh, Amira, we can't get you a purpose. You'll have to figure out your purpose when you're older, and sometimes even adults don't know what their own purpose is." At this point, Amira was getting a little annoyed. She said, "I said a porpoise. Porpoise, the sea mammal, like a small dolphin." Her grandparents said, "Oh, sorry, we misheard you, but we wouldn't have bought you a porpoise either. They belong in the wild, dear." Amira was fuming. Why had no one understood her when she wanted a porpoise? And now that she thought about it, why were the adults unwilling to give her a purpose either? What was a purpose anyway? So Amira set out about finding a purpose. Over the next several years, she asked a lot of adults she knew and trusted. Some of the adults said, "I don't know. That's a really hard thing to explain." But some of the adults gave her some really good advice. They said, "Pay attention to the things you care about and how you can use those things to make a difference in the world. You may not have a clear idea about it yet, and your purpose will certainly change over time. But if you think about the things you value and how you can use those things for good, you'll be on the right track." So, Amira thought about the things that she valued and cared about, things like animals and the habitats they live in. She thought about the things she liked to do, things like learning new things and teaching those things to younger children. She thought about her heroes, people who were living their lives in ways that she wanted to copy. And she thought about what was possible and ways that she could change the world when she was older. And eventually, after some time and some work, Amira came up with her purpose. And the funny thing is that Amira's purpose didn't stray too far from porpoises. She decided that her purpose was to be a caring advocate for the earth and teach others about conservation. And that's just what she did.
Thank you, Della. That was a wonderful story after all. When I was growing up, I was fortunate to have all four of my grandparents alive and living in the same area near my home. I also had a great-grandmother, 3 uncles, 1 aunt, and 1 great-aunt in that same geographical location. I didn't know how lucky I was to have these people as resources for my own life. It wasn't until I was looking back on my early life, on how I became me, that I realized how much each of these people had taught me. And I learned different things from different people, different generations, different life circumstances. Well, of course, it was my mother who taught me the most and possibly the most important things because she was with me the most those early years. She taught me how to read before I went to school. She told me I could do anything I wanted in the world if I only wanted it badly enough. She taught me determination. And not surprisingly, in the end, she was the one I rebelled against most, stood firm against and said, "Stop. I can go on from here without you." But I think that's common. It was my great aunt that had the most long-lasting influence on me. She was the one who was most different from the rest, the one the rest of them laughed at, lamented about, shook their heads over. And in the end, she was the one who said I could be whoever I wanted to be, not just do, even if it was different from the rest of the family, from the rest of the world. She taught me freedom to choose. And I think not everybody has that kind of familial depth anymore. Not everybody has relatives alive or nearby or even interested in them. We move around more. We are scattered from our ancestors and our progenitors. People gather intentional families because they have no nuclear families. And we learn from teachers, from books, from mistakes, from mentors, where we can, when we can. But it's not all bad. Sometimes we can learn from history, and it's not just as individuals, it's us as groups, as communities, as institutions. So here's where I'm coming from today. We keep hearing about the date 1961, when the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association voted to combine forces, to consolidate and merge the two denominations into the Unitarian Universalist Association of Churches. Yeah, that's us. That's who we are today. But what we don't hear as much is who we were before we married. Who were these two families, these parents of ours, these grandparents, these aunts, uncles, and especially the beloved outliers who taught us we could be? No, that we could become. History didn't stop in 1961, but it certainly didn't start there either. It's not too late to learn who we came to be or might still become as Unitarian Universalists. After the merger, in 1973, the Commission on Appraisal, that body that is charged by the board with exploring various past and future concerns of the larger Unitarian Universalist organization, looked at what had happened in the intervening years between 1961 and that date. And their first decision was to look back before the merger, because our histories are long, counted from the non-Trinitarian protests that grew out of the Council of Nicaea in 325 before the Common Era. Of our organized institutions, the commissioners said this: the Universalists and the Unitarian denominations were founded by theological liberals of the 18th and 19th centuries, and both of them trace the roots far back into the distant past. Both were founded on hope and heresies, and from the time of their origin have been strikingly optimistic in their understanding of God, of human nature, and of salvation. Both have been strikingly open and inclusive in their attitudes toward the world's varied religions and scriptures. Our churches have always been democratic in organization, optimistic, open and inclusive, democratic in their organization. They certainly pass those qualities on to us. Both denominations preached anti-Trinitarianism, and both of them preached universal salvation. But the emphasis was just slightly different in each. According to that 1973 report, the Universalists began with neither script nor purse, and they gathered their congregations largely from the unchurched and from dissident elements in the Orthodox churches. Their members were small tradesmen, farmers, and wage earners. Their preachers were, with few exceptions, of scant formal education. In contrast, the Unitarians had strong churches from the beginning. In 1825, when the American Unitarian Association was first organized, 150 liberal churches of various names and understandings joined the association. Their clergy were highly educated, and the membership on the whole was affluent and cultured. And it was these two varied beginnings that kept the denominations friends for so long, but never lovers. And of course, people speculated about getting together. You know it was serious when jokes were made about one another. Thomas Starr King, one of the first ministers to have served in both Unitarian and Universalist congregations, quipped, "One of them thinks God is too good to damn them forever. That would have been the Universalist. And the other thinks they are too good to be damned forever. In other words, the Universalists put more stress on the love and grace of God, and the Unitarians put more stress on humankind's natural goodness. Similar, but different. And that's how we began in this country. And it is important to remember that merger was only approved in the United States. Both denominations operate separately still in other places in the world where they operate at all. When I come back, I'll say more about how each of us began to change on the rocky road toward merger. But first, I want to give you my generosity report. I have a report from Dan Sexton about our current stewardship campaign. So far, he has contributions emailed from 11 families, which include members of the board and trustees, and me, and a few others. In the first week of the stewardship campaign, we have received pledges of $48,000. And most folks, he reported, who have pledged have increased their pledges over last year. So those of you who haven't responded yet to the email request for pledges, please don't wait until the last minute. Turn in your pledges now. All you have to do is email back that form that Dan sent you. Let me give you an update of another kind that might help you. The winter freeze last month did cause some damage in our building. The pipes in the restroom within Jagger's parlor burst, creating a hole in the wall from its explosive force and a flood into the hall and the nursery. We are not asking for pledges to repair this, but I thought it important that you know what is happening so you don't think of this as a financial burden on the congregation going into the new church year. Our insurance company covered the damage with a $2,500 payment on our part. We have already received one check from them for $20,000, which will cover new carpet in the hallways and a rebuilding of the walls that had to be removed due to mold. We are in pretty good shape considering the extent of the damage, and some plans are changing about rebuilding, maybe adding to the parlor and to the halls. I have a very brief reading this morning from our Minister Chris Bice. I gave you one humorous description of the differences between Unitarians and Universalists. Here is another from Chris. He said, "What's the difference between cats and dogs?" And the answer is, dogs look at people and say, they feed us, they give us shelter, they take care of our every need, they must be gods. And cats look at people and say, they feed us, they give us shelter, they take care of our every need. We must be gods. Well, cats or dogs, we have learned to get along. Before I tell you more, let me tell you that we get along well. We have learned that we can lean on one another. So please join me in singing the hymn from our teal hymnal, Lean on Me.
Tomorrow.
I have to tell you, all the people involved with the recording this morning were clapping and moving around. I hope you enjoyed that song as much as we did. My second response is this. You must recall, since we are looking at the histories of the two founding denominations, that both of them came from Christian backgrounds, were founded as Christian churches, with the Bible as their historical scripture and the library as their practical source of inspiration and learning. I know one Unitarian minister in our history had a bookcase as his pulpit, which he called the three-ring Bible, indicating we weren't limited to ancient teachings or just the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. The early humanist movement was mainly Unitarian, but Universalists participated in that as well. Both denominations believed, however, in the values and principles that the other proclaimed. That's why it was eventually possible to create a merger, which has been described as, quote, a flirtation that lasted 100 years, an engagement in 1959, and then a marriage in 1961, the final legal incorporation of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and the date we most often remember. So what were the objections to the merger? Well, they mostly arose from fear that each denomination could lose its historical identity as well as their personal identity. One Back Bay matron was reportedly heard to sniff that Universalists were, quote, nothing but Baptists who could read, unquote. Universalist complains that Unitarians don't feel they had a good sermon unless they don't quite understand it themselves. There was still that fear that the Unitarians were too upper class, too intellectual, and that the Universalists were too working class, too laid back. But the truth was both denominations had urban and rural churches across the country. Both embraced the religious humanists in their memberships, and both had representatives of varying classes of humanity. The Universalists feared that they might be swallowed up by the larger Unitarian denomination, and the Unitarians feared the merger might be a drag on their growth. But jibes and fears aside, there was impetus for merger. The two denominations had headquarters across the street from one another. They joined to create the Council of Liberal Churches in October of 1953. I mean, the first steps had been taken right there, whether they knew it or not. Participating churches of both denominations were solicited for their views, and their views were offered. They discussed the ideas for more than half a decade. And according to one historian, uniting proved only slightly more complex than merging, say, General Electric with General Motors. In poll after poll, the desperate merger commission sent out more than 140,000 pieces of literature to participating churches. There were differences, both organizational and theological. The Universalists were not poor, but their money was held in state conventions. The Unitarians were not rich, but their money was concentrated in Boston. Universalists were accustomed to biennial conventions out across the country, and Unitarians had their beloved May meetings annually and always at the foot of Beacon Hill. Misconceptions and not a few anomalies prevailed. Universalists tended to be viewed as conservative, but it was they who launched the experimental Charles Street Meeting House across from the stately, staid old Arlington Street Church. Unitarians were viewed as radical, but it was they whose national journal was called the Christian Register. Go figure. And of course, all feared the loss of identity. While the simple name of United Liberal Church was proposed and might seem logical, it became clear that both denominational names had to be included in a final appellation, which to this day remains a bit awkward and too lengthy to conveniently write on a check. And so we settled, at least among ourselves, for calling ourselves UUs, Once, when we were still advertising our sermon titles in the local newspaper, I gave them one over the phone with UU in the title, and it was printed, Y-O-U, Y-O-U. I guess they thought we were an antidote to the me generation. Well, as merger grew closer, a host of issues and their advocates grew more intense. Before final ratification, no less than 23 amendments were made to the merger agreement. That's in addition to the ones that had already been proposed. America's leading religious journal at the time, the Christian Century, called the merger, quote, the most thorough sounding of the views of a religious people in modern times, unquote. In October 1959, only 2 words separated the Unitarians and the Universalists from consolidating into one denomination, and the words were the and are. These tiny words took on a much larger symbolism than their usual utilitarian grammar might think. They defined whether the new denomination would refer to our Judeo-Christian heritage, as many Universalists hoped, or the Judeo-Christian heritage favored by Unitarians. But the most significant date was October 31, 1959. On that day, nearly 1,000 delegates, some 400 Universalists and 600 Unitarians, had gathered for a special meeting and approved the last and most contentious of the total 57 amendments before them, the wording of the purposes and objectives of the new Unitarian Universalist Association. The final approved text referred to the Judeo-Christian heritage, language that would remain until the UUA adopted the new principles and purposes. And that didn't occur until 1985, nearly a quarter century later, because some getting used to each other, some jockeying for position, continued to take place in the early years. And then what? Let's look at that later. For now, stories from this time and place. I talked with Carrie Donahue this week. You might remember that Carrie and her husband Brian lost their beloved dog a month or so ago. A cruel fate wasn't done with them. Brian has been ill. Carrie, who has a disability, has been his caretaker. Recently, Carrie's nephew ended his own life over a heartbreak. The family has asked for the use of the sanctuary for a memorial service for family members, and we, of course, have said yes. Both Brian and Carrie are in the current updated directory that you can find on your website. But their emails are their names, and don't forget Brian's is spelled with a Y, not an I, and Donahue is spelled D-O-N-A-H-U-E, and they're both at yahoo.com. I'm sure they'd love to know you are thinking of them. I have a couple of other stories to share as well. Good news is Eliza and Brett Thornton had their common assessment at school recently. This is a twice-a-year progress check at school, and both of them received a master's assessment. And of course, the good news in the community is all adults over 17 are now eligible for vaccination. Do sign up. It's going to be great. The more people we get vaccinated, it will help us come back together sooner. Let us take a moment to consider the stories that live in this church, that live in this world in which we are a part. Let us take just a moment to close our eyes, take a deep breath, and hold in our hearts all those people who are concerned and weary and sad and tired, but also all those people who are celebrating in spite of what's going on in the world because of the pandemic. Let us think of ourselves and give ourselves a pat on the back for surviving this long and keeping the hope that we will soon be together again. And after a moment's silence, we will have some meditation music. So continue to think on these things. On a little secret, there are things that go on during our recording session with no one in the congregation because you're all listening online. And there are things that you don't see. During that musical interlude, there was much frantic scrambling and battery changing. I don't know if you got all of the music during that time, but it is interesting what is going on. Here's my third response. Some of the fears held by Universalists before merger have arguably been borne out. The UUA headquarters continued at 25 Beacon Street, the Unitarians' denominational home, and the Unitarians' president became the first president of the merged congregations. The last two Universalist theological schools were shut down, and despite efforts to maintain both names, the media, as well as many Unitarian Universalists themselves, often dropped the Universalist from the name. Universalists were broadening their theological exploration in a search for world fellowship at the time of the merger. And the new question became, how do we position ourselves to grow rather than who are we and what precisely is our message to this age? In the early 20th century, Universalism had moved beyond the theological idea that a loving God does not send people to hell to a more demanding and radical ethical universalism that we, not just God, must love and treat equally everyone in the human family as they are. And that is still a distinctive doctrine for us today, even though it's a difficult one. Unitarianism lost its lofty idea of itself. Part of that was the growth of the religious humanist movement to include secular humanists as well. And there remains a kind of confusion among members of most churches when words like worship and theology, even faith, are used, requiring redefinition for every conversation. The God of science was referenced often during the remainder of the 20th century, and declarations of, "I believe only in what I can see and touch and hold in my hand," were met with reminders that we affirm and support things like justice, equity, compassion, and love, which have no body, image, or portability. Sermons and conversations came to include storytelling and a search for the spiritual life instead of lofty cerebral declarations that were off-putting to some. Women made their way into leadership roles. There were fears in that as well, some predicting that ministry would become a pink-collar position and wouldn't pay enough to raise a family on. Pagans took their place as members of our congregations, not just renters that held their meetings in our buildings. Gays and lesbians were welcomed and became a large part of the movement and the conversation around faith and action. From our Unitarian grandparents and great-aunts, we maintained the belief that education would better both the family and those with whom it came into contact. From Universalists, the idea of a human family and acceptance of world religions, marriage equality, racial equality. From both, we inherited a rugged determinism to be better and to do better, to welcome those that the larger society disparaged, to accept the term heretic and celebrate its original meaning as the ability to choose. To covenant rather than to declaim, to forgive rather than banish, and to explore rather than expound. Oh, we inherited the family weaknesses as well, to be self-congratulatory in our successes, to carry individualism to an extreme to the degree that the concept of beloved community often gets buried under the rhetoric of freedom and has to be reclaimed and celebrated once again. But we also inherited a broad sense of humor and a deep sense of optimism. May they carry us through the years until we can lay down our swords and shields and take up the tambourine and dance. Let us celebrate our marriage of 40 years with a song of merger. Our closing hymn is titled as Tranquil Streams That Meet and Merge. It's number 145 in your hymn book.
As tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea, our kindred hearts and minds unite to build a church that shall be free, free from the bonds that bind the mind to narrow thought and lifeless creed, free from a social code that fails to serve the cause of human need, a freedom that reveres the past but trusts the dawning future more, and bids the soul in search of truth adventure boldly and explore. Prophetic church, the future waits your liberating ministry. Go forth in hope, the power of love, proclaim the truth that makes us free.
Our chalice has burned as a symbol of our past, our present, and our future. We are here in the present, many of us only recently and didn't even participate in the past. Many of us won't participate in the future. But both are dependent on us to remember, to celebrate, and to look forward. Extinguish the chalice because we take it in our individual hearts and minds as we go forward into the new week. I go back to my favorite words about our church from Theodore Parker, who was a Unitarian minister, but who thought like a Universalist. He said, "Be ours a religion which like sunshine goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its rituals, works of love. Its profession of faith, divine living. So may it be in all our lives."